You know, some places, they just have a feeling about them, right? They're more than just brick and mortar. They are soaked in stories. And today, we're going to a place that has some incredible stories, where hope and, well, horror basically lived side by side. The Waverly Hills Sanatorium. Just look at this building. It sits up on a hill outside Louisville, Kentucky, and it is absolutely massive. This place was originally built as a beacon of hope, a weapon in the fight against a terrifying plague. But after the battle was over and its halls went silent, a much, much darker story started to take its place. So you have to wonder, right? What on earth happened inside those walls? And that's exactly what we're here to figure out. Because to really understand the legends of Waverly, you have to start with the history. And trust me, the history is just as chilling as any ghost story.
So let's dive in. Our story here doesn't start with ghosts. It starts with a real-life horror, a terrifying disease that was sweeping across the nation.
They called it the White Plague, sometimes consumption. And that name is because the disease literally looked like it was consuming its victims from the inside out. It was devastating. And get this, back in 1900, Louisville was the absolute epicenter. It had the highest TB death rate in the entire country. The city was desperate for a place to isolate the sick and just try to fight back. And you can see just how fast this crisis exploded. It started in 1910 as this small two-story building for maybe 50 patients. But the demand was so overwhelming that by 1926, it was this enormous 5-story Gothic hospital that could hold over 400 people. I mean, for decades, this place was a battleground. And then, just like that, medicine caught up, antibiotics were discovered, and by 1961, Waverly Hills wasn't needed anymore, and it shut its doors. All right, so to keep this disease contained, Waverly Hills had to become a world of its own, completely cut off from everything else. And when I say its own world, I mean it. This place was basically a self-sufficient city. It had its own zip code, a post office, everything. They grew their own food, raised their own livestock. If you were a patient or you worked there, you were on the hill and you did not leave. You were completely quarantined. So what was the treatment like before they had real drugs? Well, the best thing they had was shockingly simple: fresh air. That was it. Patients were wheeled out onto these open-air porches, these solariums, year-round. It didn't matter if it was a beautiful spring day or the middle of a freezing Kentucky winter. The hope was that nature itself could somehow heal them. But when fresh air just wasn't enough, the desperation really kicked in. Doctors turned to some incredibly extreme experimental surgeries. We're talking about things like intentionally collapsing a lung to let it rest, or even surgically removing a patient's ribs so their lungs had more space to expand. These were brutal last-ditch efforts. And honestly, many patients who didn't die from tuberculosis ended up dying from these so-called cures. With so much death, they had a really grim problem. How do you remove the bodies without causing a total panic among the other patients? Well, the legend says they had an answer: the death tunnel. Now, officially, this was a 500-foot-long tunnel built to move supplies up the steep hill. But the story goes that it was secretly repurposed as a body chute, a way to get the dead out of sight, out of mind. And this is where the documented history of Waverly really starts to bleed into its mythology. And that brings us to the hospital's second act. After it closed down, all that history of suffering, it didn't just go away. It evolved into stories of haunting. If you ask any paranormal investigator about Waverly, they'll tell you the 5th floor is one of the most active areas, and the dark heart of that floor is this room right here, room 502. The legend is incredibly tragic and specific. The story goes that in 1928, a nurse who was unmarried and pregnant took her own life in this room. And then another story says a different nurse jumped to her death from the roof patio just outside only 4 years later. But here is what is so fascinating. For stories that are so powerful and so detailed, there are no official records to back them up. None. And that's a theme you see again and again at Waverly, this blurry, indistinct line between historical fact and powerful folklore. And it is definitely not just room 502. Visitors report all kinds of encounters throughout the building. There's the spirit of a little boy named Timmy, who people say will play with a ball if you roll one down the hallway. There are constant reports of shadow people, these dark, human-shaped figures that dart in and out of rooms. And then there's a more menacing presence they call the creeper, which is said to crawl along the walls and ceilings. Not to mention the usual stuff, door slamming, disembodied voices, and people seeing faces in the windows.
So after it closed, the sanatorium fell into neglect for decades. It was crumbling. So how did this monument to a medical tragedy become this huge landmark of dark tourism? What actually saved it from the wrecking ball? Well, ironically, the very stories that make the building so terrifying are the reason it's still standing today. Its reputation as one of America's most haunted places drew so much public interest that it was ultimately saved from demolition. The ghost stories literally saved it. And now, those haunted legends and the historical reality exist side by side. The money that comes in from all the paranormal tours and the historical visits goes directly into preserving the building. The ghosts are basically paying to restore their own home, making sure this important and, really chilling piece of history survives. In the end, Waverly Hills is so much more than a haunted house. It's a place where history, tragedy, and folklore all collide. And it forces you to ask the question, why are we so drawn to the echoes of these places where so much was lost?